Hey class, hey, we're back. And this is the second part of managing our waste. This is focusing on hazardous waste. Sorry for the lack of creativity in the first slide, but I did break this up into two. So last week we talked about municipal solid waste. That's the stuff that just the stuff you every day would just throw away in a garbage can or recycle or what have you. And now we're focusing more on hazardous wastes and the problem that they pose, the challenges that we face in regards to them, and then the solutions to the issue. Now, as you know, I have the cockatiel who's been chatting. The pug is next to me, just like the last lecture. And so those are my disclaimers as far as any weird noises you might hear in the background. So now, although like last week with solid waste and solid waste management, that affected us in the way that we all produce solid waste, this municipal solid waste at the tune of like 4.6 pounds per person per day, the stuff that you throw away in your garbage can. Hazardous waste is more of a kind of more industrial and manufacturing wastes, the liquids and the stuff that goes into the air. You are also individually, there's also some stewardship initiatives, and we touched on this a bit when we talked about toxins in the environment in the ecosystems lecture, and also as far as in the water lecture, as far as how to avoid water pollution, because you do have hazardous waste in your house that then you dispose of, like paint thinners in your garage and different adhesives and all that. But this kind of is more geared towards, or is more of an issue with manufacturing and industry. Not that it isn't of concern to us, of course, because we're trying to desperately keep this stuff out of the environment, because there's a reason they call it hazardous waste, and this is nasty stuff. And as you see there, it's not only toxic, like dangerous for the health of living things, causing problems, including death, but also things that are corrosive, ignitable, reactive. I mean, these are the really nasty things. And now these are highly regulated in the US today, but there's lots of laws and legislation that are on the books nowadays to keep this keep these out of the environment, but this didn't always used to be the case. There were no laws, or very few, that regulated these toxins in the environment, and the laws that did come into place were not that long ago. And so there were lots and lots of things that were dumped into the environment that are still a problem, or that are resurfacing because they're so pervasive in our environment. They last so long. And I think that we saw this with, hi, little Benny. Oh, there's another dog. So that's why it continues to be an issue, certainly to not the extent that it used to be. But things still get dumped into our environment. And the other part of this is that not every place in the world has the environmental laws that we do to keep this stuff out of the environment. There are lots of developing nations who still just dump toxins into their rivers, onto the land, into the oceans. And as I've used the analogy before, we are all on the same ship. We're all on planet Earth, and it ultimately will someday affect us. And you still have these problems in the environment. You still have problems of what we say orphan dumping, and that is that there are those who in this country try to skirt around the environmental legislations and dump things illegally, which is a problem. Now, I will say, like, here in the US, we have strict environmental laws that regulate these issues, but we don't have the strictest. Europeans have much stricter laws, so I will say that it's, oh, hold on. You have to go out, Benny. Here, go ahead. Go ahead. Have to go. No? Okay. Sorry about that. And you remember this from the ecosystems lecture? Like all of these, excuse me, all of these different really terrible things that we have manufactured for one reason or another, you know, whether they're pesticides or whether they're herbicides or, you know, adhesives that are extremely toxic. So how do we regulate these, or how do we manage these in the environment? Well, legislation is key, and as I mentioned, you know, relatively recently, it wasn't until the 1970s until we really dug deep into recognizing that these are a problem. And you did watch several weeks ago the Love Canal film, so you saw that as far as how this was not regulated at all at one point. But the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and has several amendments since the mid-1970s when it was implemented, is a what we call a cradle to grave initiative as far as the legislation is concerned. That is that many. Go ahead, Ben. Go ahead out. Go. The point is that the different statutes of these laws, they monitor the manufacturing of these particular chemicals, the shipment of these chemicals, how they are disposed of, where they are used, and the use of them. So that's where we say it's a cradle to grave type of monitoring, because it has to be in order to keep these out of the environment as much as possible. And oh, this is a great graphic. It's a little fuzzy here, but as part of not just the RCRA, but all sorts of other environmental laws and legislation to keep these hazardous materials out of the environment, whether it's, you know, we talked about the Safe Water Drinking Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. It all plays a part. There's the RCRA in the upper right-hand corner. Super fun. This is to clean up abandoned hazardous waste sites. The Toxic Substance Control Act requires new chemicals to be shown safe for specific use. This is testing to make sure that they are safe before they're released. Department of Transportation, even how these are transported, so they don't get into the environment. That's part of the Department of Transportation. OSHA, you know, if many of you work, you have to adhere to OSHA guidelines and have OSHA training. That is, any chemicals that are used in the environment where you work, even the cleaning supplies, you have to be made aware of them to keep you safe. I mean, OSHA also protects things like, you know, making sure that the equipment that you're using is safe, not just the chemicals, but the hazardous materials fall under this. And the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, that is, you know, in facilities that manufacture these, the communities that surround them, it is the public right to know that these facilities exist in their communities, and then to also have a plan of action if there's some sort of a spill or some sort of a release. And unfortunately, you know, we learned this the hard way. And if you look up Bhopal, India, Bhopul, I think, or Pal, where there was a hazardous spill, and nobody really even knew that this existed in their community, and there was no action put into place if there was some sort of an accident. And you had many people die as a result of that. Now, disposing, you know, just like municipal solid waste, sometimes what do you do with it? You have to somehow dispose of that. And there are certain ways, and these all sound like some students, when I present this in class, they just laugh. They're like, "Are you serious? This is the best they can do?" It's like, yeah. Yeah. What is being phased out, but is still used, but which was the primary way to use these, is surface impoundments. That is, the liquid hazardous wastes are just stored in like an artificial pond. Now, it used to be that they didn't used to be lined with a liner, and it just would wind up soaking into the ground and getting into groundwater, but they've since then lined them so you didn't have that soaking. Yeah, I mean, it not that great a way to dispose, especially when you think that a lot of these chemicals are volatile and they can evaporate, so they avoid doing this with really volatile chemicals. I know, like down in the Philadelphia airport, when I did my PhD work down there with turtles, and they had a pond right next to where they de-ice the planes with glycol chemicals, which is implicated in all sorts of terrible cancers, etc. And it was called the glycol pond. And they just used to run, when they would de-ice the planes, the excess glycol would just run into this big pond that they had. And now they have a recapture system where it drains into pipes and then is stored in tanks, the excess glycol. But we used to pull turtles out of there that were alive. We did turtle tagging, but they were really a lot of them were deformed because of the glycol. Hazardous waste landfills. So these are landfills where you can take hazardous wastes, and they go to extra measures to be sure that the environment is not contaminated, to be sure that they don't leak. And then deep well injection. It seems so archaic, but what they do is they just dig a well really, really deep into the ground, well below the water table, and they just inject it into the ground, which seems kind of crazy, but that's what the graphic is. But that is what they say will not contaminate the groundwater or the soil because it is that deep. So you can dispose of hazardous waste in one of these three methods. And then there are personal stewardship initiatives and endeavors. When you have hazardous waste in your own house, you don't put them down the drain. Don't put them down a sewer grate. Don't throw them away. They should be disposed of properly, and you can take them to places, but you can also, usually twice a year, your community or your county will hold a hazardous waste collection event, as you see in the lower right-hand corner. I know NAC sponsors this, not lately, but they sponsor this twice a year, where you bring in the stuff that's on your shelves in your garage, and it's for free. Now, not all events are, but the NAC one, I believe, still is you take these to these collection events, and then they dispose of them properly. It keeps these toxins from going into the wrong places. Additional laws and legislations are necessary, like when you had the current laws and legislations, like the RCRA, and the ongoing ones, and the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. That addresses, to keep things out of the environment, but we need, it was apparent, a set of laws to address the mistakes that we did make in the past before there was any laws or legislation, because these chemicals persist in the environment and they need to be cleaned up. Somebody needs to take responsibility for these and make sure then that these areas are cleaned up properly and that they are safe. And that is where we have CERCLA, Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act of 1980, also known as a Superfund Act. And so what has to happen is a place has to be identified as such. And it is labeled as Superfund. It's given that particular designation depending upon, how close it is to people, which is a bit unfortunate because even if it's not near people, it still hazardous the other life that lives around it. But somehow they have to prioritize this. How likely it is that the waste will spread, and if drinking water is somehow at risk. And so it's identified as a Superfund site, and on the right you see the graphic of all of the Superfund sites in Pennsylvania. We have a lot of them because historically we've had a lot of industry and manufacturing here. And I know for one of your activities, I think it was last week or it might be this week, you identify the closest site to your house, which is really alarming using the Superfund Superfund guidelines. Now, once it is identified, then it is cleaned up. Generally, it takes about 15 years, $25 million and 15 years. That's if the funds are available, because what was the case is that the private industries that created the messes, once, getting this rolled out, the Superfund, and those funds were used to clean up the sites, and then Congress raided the piggy bank for other purposes, and then became bankrupt, of course, and now it is a taxpayer instead of private industry. Places can sue. The EPA can sue private industry, but they have good lawyers, right? And doesn't always happen and gets tied up in the courts. And so now this is funded by you and me, us as taxpayers, and the funds are not always available. So how do we do this? How do you clean up a Superfund site? It's covered by the graphic, but it says cleaning up. Physical removal is you would, if the soil is contaminated, you basically remove that soil. You physically remove it, you dig it out, and then you take it to a hazardous waste facility. This is enormously arduous to do and takes a long time, but you have to do what you have to do, right? Water can be even trickier because, water kind of flows from one place to another. And with contaminated water, it's the same thing. You have to remove all of the contaminated water and remove that. Well, I just said that. Remove the contaminated water, separate it somehow from the non-contaminated water, and clean the substrate that's around it as well until it is deemed safe. So you have these physical means of doing so. Burning. This is successful if you burn. As far as some of the organic compounds actually will burn and will then become inert substances. You have, just like when we were talking about cleaning up water spills, it's the same concept, and that's bioremediation. That is, you can have certain organisms like protists or bacteria that will break down harmful substances, harmful toxins. No, it's not going to work. To try to get the title back up again. And turn them into harmless substances. Phytoremediation is when you do this with plants, and you remember this from the water lecture, and that is if the soil is contaminated, you have plants that will uptake those particular metals, and they will either just convert them into something less volatile, or the plants get removed and then they get burnt. So these are ways of removing or cleaning up these Superfund sites. Oh, whoops, forgot that was the end. I'm going to